Hi there. JJ, I'm back with the 5th video that contains predictive content. Now, as I said, I'm from Paranormal Talks, paranormaltalks.com. We are educational around the paranormal, supernatural, and other woo-woo stuff. You know, that huge part of our world that we can't see and that has a big impact on us. Stuff that's beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic. All the rest of us, and we are quite massive. So, this video is about Edgar Cayce's predictions. And as I said in the very first video, the astrology video, I'm pulling together information from many sources across the decades. So you can get a broad span of the consistency of these predictions about our country, America, our economy, and our politics, and also a little bit that touches on other countries, how they might impact us. So Edgar Cayce. Now I started reading and understanding and using the Edgar Cayce readings starting in 1964. So I've been around for a while with these readings, and I've tested the readings, which are mostly medical. 80% of his readings, of which there's about 15,000 readings for individuals. Of those 15,000, about 80% are medical, and they are specifically for children, since that's who he wanted to help, and that's mostly who came to him and who he accepted to help. And then the other 20% is about other stuff, other predictive stuff, which we'll talk about in this video. So this is Edgar Cayce. This is a pretty formal photograph of Edgar Cayce in his later years, in his later years before he died. I don't know when this was taken, but he may have died shortly after this, some years later. But this is Edgar Cayce. Now, he has impacted generations of people in the United States. And Edgar Cayce has an organization called the Association of Research and Enlightenment. He really pushed to have something like that formed to house his 15,000 readings for access by the masses after he was gone. And people can start and have what are called Edgar Cayce study groups, where they study the spiritual principles that Edgar Cayce set forth in his 15,000 readings. And it's interesting that the most number of Edgar Cayce members of the Association of Research and Enlightenment and Edgar Cayce study groups is found in Japan. Not the United States, but Japan. Interesting, huh? But his material has impacted generations of people in the United States and around the world, and it has saved their lives. I mean, his health readings has saved their lives. Now, the 20% of his other readings are very intriguing. Let me give you a little background on Edgar Cayce so you'll know where this came from. Again, he's a source of predictive information that has a great track record of earth changes, political changes, economic changes for our country in particular and around the world. So Edgar Cayce was born in 1877 and he died in 1945. And he's been called the sleeping prophet since his predictions were so accurate and some quite detailed. He's also called the father of holistic medicine. Probably, above all, he is the inventor, originator, and father of holistic medicine that we know today. Our holistic diet, food that we use, Edgar Cayce. The medical treatments that we now have with chiropractors and others and osteopaths, Edgar Cayce. Anything outside of the traditional mainstream, Edgar Cayce. That's why we have such great alternative health care now, is because of Edgar Cayce. and his health readings. So he is, yes, indeed, probably he's the most documented psychic of the 20th century here in the United States. He was born in Kentucky, and his psychic abilities began to appear in early childhood, as many great psychics do. As an adult, Cayce would put himself into a state of meditation, kind of a trance, connecting with the universal consciousness, and from this state came his readings. You know, the way Cayce diagrammed it, the source of his information, since we'll be getting into that, I want you to know where it actually comes from. And I'm sorry this camera is shaking so much, because we live in earthquake country here. We keep having earthquakes. No, not really, but it could happen. Depends. So our consciousness is we have our consciousness, which is kind of small. It is really actually quite small. And then we have the subconscious, which is rather larger, and it kind of sits above the consciousness. And then above the subconscious is the super consciousness, where you can access everything, all information. You can access the library in the sky, which we call the Akashic Records. The library in the sky, which contains a book on each one of us, of our souls. And then a lot of other information. So anything you want to know is in the super consciousness. And you access that from your consciousness through your subconscious and then into the super consciousness. Or crooked. Okay? So that's where Edgar Cayce got his material, his content in his readings. So from holistic health and the treatments of illness to dream interpretation and reincarnation, who we were in a past lifetime, Cayce's readings and insights give practical help and advice to individuals from all walks of life, even today. You know, he had leaders of industry visiting him. He had presidents, he had vice presidents visiting him for readings. Mostly around their reincarnation past life. Yes. And then lesser people who came to him for stock investment advice, which didn't work out too well. He actually had some pretty bad health problems that came upon him when he would give readings on who the horse in the horse race would be winning this coming weekend. That didn't work out. So he misused his gift, his psychic ability. It came back at him in a very unhealthy manner. So he learned very quickly not to do that, to do stock predictions and horse racing predictions. Okay, so I'm going to read to you some readings that Cayce gave to help you understand and set a baseline of his track record, of his accuracy. So Cayce gave around the area of predictions for our country, the United States, and what's coming up for us, and how other countries will be impacting us. So 80% of Cayce's readings, 80% were around health, how to heal yourself from incurable diseases, which worked. The other 20% were around other things, reincarnation and also world affairs. So Cayce gave 29 readings from 1921 to 1944 that were all grouped together by the Association of Research and Enlightenment, that organization that keeps his readings. And that grouping of readings, those 29, they labeled World Affairs Readings. The World Affair readings were given in response to questions from requesters who came to Cayce with these questions, who were concerned about the global events around them. So a lot of these readings, these World Affairs readings, were actually delivered in 1932. And you know what was happening in our country in 1932. Things were falling apart. We were in the Great Depression. People didn't have enough to eat. They were malnutreated. 1932. The world affairs readings were about the future of world finance, world leadership, collective spirituality, and the role that Russia was to play as a force of right in the coming global turmoil that we see unfolding before our eyes today. Twice the world affairs readings mention this specifically. Out of Russia will come the hope of the world. Now, I've already warned you guys, if you don't agree with this stuff, if it upsets or offends your current beliefs or philosophies, just close the video. Close it right now. Close it. Okay, thank you. Those who remain, I'll read the rest of this to you. Now, Cayce said this in 1921 to 32. He said this. This is well recorded. So he's saying, out of Russia will come the hope of the world. So we'll see. This hope is tied to the spirit of the nation, not a specific individual, not a specific person. The first statement was given in 1932, specifically mentions Russia's gradual religious development. The second, given in 1944, indicates the concern of the Russian people for their fellow man that is the basis for this hope. So out of Russia will come the hope of the world. So we're talking about the hope, which is an emotional thing, which has a lot of power, especially if a lot of people have that same emotion. The world affairs readings also indicate that an equitable partnership between Russia and the United States could become beneficial for both, as Russia possesses more raw resources than any other nation on this planet. I thought China did, but no, Russia does. Russia does. And the U.S. has better abilities to develop, process those resources. Okay? So that's the intro, sort of. Next, let me give you another reading. In February of 1932, in response to a question from a requester, another person who came to Cayce with a problem, is this requester asked, what should be the attitude of so-called capitalist nations, like America, Europe, towards Russia? And Cayce responded from the superconscious space on Russia's religious development, that is, getting closer to God or getting closer to their own their own spirituality as individual people, will come the greater hope of the world. So it's probably not so much about religion as getting close to the God within, the Christ within, that spiritual stuff within. That is the hope of the world. Then that one or group that is closer in its relationships to their spiritual stuff may fare the better in the gradual changes and final settlement of conditions as to the rule of the world. So what this seems to indicate is it's not from force, it's not from arms, it's not from bombs, it's not from tanks, it's not from money, it's from a spiritual place. Now that can be pretty scary to some people, but that's what Cayce said in 1932 in response to that question about how capitalists what the attitude should be towards Russia. Okay? Another question in 1932 also. The question was, should the United States recognize the present government in Russia? Man, that doesn't seem to go away, does it? Answer from Edgar Cayce. Many conditions should be considered were this to be answered correctly. You could say yes and no, and both would be right. with the present attitude of both peoples as a nation, and both be wrong. For this is to come. There will come an entire change in the attitude of both nations as powers in the financial and economical world occur. As for those of raw resources, Russia surpasses all other nations. As for abilities for development of raw resources, those in the United States are the farthest ahead. Then these united, Russia and United States, in a symbiotic relationship, or upon an equitable basis, would become or could become powers. But there are many interferences for those already invested in it not happening, those already under question, so it will take years to settle. So that was in 1932. And there's a couple more. These were predictions, 1932, 1944. Here's another one. In June of 1944, in response to a question, it provides a framework for understanding and interpreting the deeper meaning of the comments about individual nations. Question from a requester. Tell us more regarding what the vibrations of nations as individuals might mean. Give us information concerning these vibrations and the relations to the spirit of the various nations, particularly in connection with the 7 sins and 12 virtues in the human family, in our attempt to be channels of blessings to our fellow men. So, when requesters would come to Edgar Cayce with these hard questions, or with a lot of problems, they were more spiritual, actually, and that's okay. So this person had quite a question. In response, Cayce said, "What then of nations? In Russia there comes the hope of the world, not as that sometimes termed of the communistic or the Bolshevistic, no, but freedom, that each man will live for his fellow man. The principle has been born in Russia. It will take years for it to be crystallized, but out of Russia comes again the hope of the world." So he's kind of repeating this over and over, isn't he? He must be insistent. I mean, he said it in 32 and then in 44. So, okay. So, what is Russia guided by? By what? That friendship with the nation that has even set on its present monetary unit, "In God we trust." He's talking about the United States. So Cayce is saying the friendship with the nation, the United States, that has set on its monetary unit, "In God we trust." So Cayce predicted World War II, which World War II started in 1939 and it went through and wrapped up in 1945. But the readings do not say that there will be a third world war. If there was, I'm sure that Cayce would have said there will be a third world war and a fourth and a fifth, etc. But he did not. In early 1935, Cayce, in a reading, warned of catastrophic events that were building within the international community. So in 1935, Cayce gave the warnings about World War II. In 1935. It happened anyway in 1939. It started anyway in 1939. Cayce said, unless there is interference from what may be called by many the supernatural forces of humanity and influences that are active in the affairs of nations and peoples, the whole world, as it were, will be set on fire by the militaristic groups and those that are for power and expansion in such associations. So that's the information you get when you can tap into the info in the superconscious. Let me give you one more here. While Cayce's predictions were based on the current conditions, individuals could assert their will and change what might happen. So how have we done with that so far, you guys? The readings where Russia is mentioned, it does not mention an individual, a definite outcome, nor a time frame. Remember, all of us collectively, as humanity, with our thoughts and actions create the future. And as Cayce said, peace begins within self. Cayce stated that if you would know peace and harmony, then bring peace and harmony to the experience of another person, of another soul, and thereby experience peace and harmony yourself. Okay, now I want to get into what Cayce says about Russia. Because Russia is the hope of the world. And this is what Russia was doing then, and what I think it continues to do today. Cayce foresaw the future world crises would hinge on finance, and he pointed to Russia as being the thorn in the side of the financial powers, the bankers, that were organizing themselves against the good of humanity in a post-World War II world. And I have to say, those bankers are still doing their naughtiness even today. When asked in 1932 about political and economic trends in Europe, Cayce focused on Russia in 1932. And you know, the seeds that are planted in 1932, they're maturing, and we're harvesting some of them now, and we'll harvest even more in the short-term coming future. Europe is as a house broken up. Some years ago, there was experience of a mighty peoples, Russian peoples, being overridden for the gratification and satisfaction of a few banking cartels, irrespective of any other man's right. That peoples of Russia are going through the experience of being born again because they went through transformation. They in effect went through a death with the collapse of communism. You know, socialism and then communism. Socialism is when we have this all nice thing that we'll all get our fair share. And then communism is when we start punching each other in the face because we feel we want more of our fair share. So when communism collapsed and their country in effect collapsed in 1998 with the collapse of their banking system. Did you know that? Russia's banking system collapsed in 1998. You're not supposed to know that, but it did. So they went through quite hard times, and they've been born again. Since humanity and nations all go through a cycle of maturation. And the Russians are now the thorn in the flesh of many, a political and financial nation in Europe and in the world, but particularly Europe. And I'm guessing these political and financial entities that he's referring to is probably the international, the European Bank. Anyway, I'll get to them here. A next question. What is the name of the nation referred to as being the thorn in the flesh of nations? Cayce answered, Russia. So, 70 years after the defeat of the Axis powers, Russia has been reborn, but the rest of the world is now largely under the thumb of the Western globalist banking cartel. This cartel is organized as the IMS, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, the global network of central banks, which includes the Federal Reserve, the reserve banks, development banks, and investment banks in London, in China, in Wall Street. These banks hold the world's greatest elected governments in perpetual receivership and the world's people in bondage to mathematically impossible payments of debt. With the destruction of Ukraine by the Color Revolution destabilization team, Putin's Russia emerged as the singular force capable of checking the banking cabal's global advance and is refusing to allow Ukraine and Crimea to fall into the hands of Western-backed forces and the banking cartels. And all the resources, all the goody, yummy resources that are in Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia. So essentially, Cayce is referring to Russia as after the trials under Soviet rule and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as the need for the world to return to humanistic values in order to free itself from the oppression of the banking cartels, which have been organizing against the human race for centuries. I mean, most of us little people. And it's not very nice. So in the final world affairs reading given June of 1944, less than 6 months before Cayce's death, he addresses the spirit and the sin of America. So we're not going to get off scot-free. We're already under a lot of pain, and it gets worse. So in 1944, Cayce says, there was a question, what is the spirit of America? Cayce answered, most individuals proudly boast freedom. Freedom of what? When you bind men's hearts and minds through the various ways and manners, does it give them freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want? In the application of these principles, America can boast, but rather in that principle being forgotten, and that is the sin of America. So be prepared. Russia will continue to be the thorn in the side of the banking cartel and the politicians of America. There'll be more to hear about Russia and predictions about Russia and how it impacts America. And that will be in the last video, number 6. So thank you so much for joining us here at Paranormal Talks, paranormaltalks.com. I am JJ, and we'll see you in the last video. See ya. Bye.